let me push you on this one. So the Commerce Clause says you can't, the federal government gets to regulate interstate commerce. But we have had such terrible rulings from the Supreme Court on the Commerce Clause. I'm not remembering the name, but there was a ruling of a farmer who was making more than his allotted number of, was it beans or something like that, and he was using it for his own use. And the Supreme Court said, doesn't matter. Because you're making beans and growing beans for your own use, that means you're not buying beans from the open marketplace. If you're not buying beans from the open marketplace to feed your own family and plant a garden for yourself, that if you have to go to the open market, that means there's something that's happening between interstate. It has the supply and demand changes between interstate. Doesn't the exact same argument apply here? That if you don't buy an insurance policy, it certainly affects interstate trade on this new insurance pools we're going to have, and therefore we, the feds, the Supreme Court could rule, have the power. If we have the power to tell you you can't grow beans on your farm for your own personal use, we certainly have the power to tell you you have to buy a health insurance policy.
We're still talking about, in the case of growing something, we're still talking about economic activity. Because you grow something, we have the power to limit how you sell it or whatever.
Or whether I use it for my own use.
That's exactly right. And this is the classic
argument. By the way, I'm not
making
making up this case.
I know. Oh, I know.
Right,
exactly.
Right.
And in fact, in a Reich case a couple years ago, conservatives were very surprised to find Scalia saying, even though marijuana is grown strictly in a state and sold in the state, because it impacts interstate commerce, it's regulated by Congress. That's exactly right. That argument's been made, and curiously enough, a district court judge in Virginia last week in the same scenario said, you know, those aren't the same case. This is the first time that they've actually tried to regulate your economic inactivity. If I can just quote, the judge says, you know, there's a lot of constitutional issues here. All of them seem to distill to the single question of whether or not Congress has the power to regulate and tax a citizen's decision not to participate in interstate commerce. There are no recorded cases from a federal appellate court extending the Commerce Clause or the Tax Clause to include the regulation of a person's decision not to purchase a product.
What surprises me about this, and I know we tend to put these things on left-right axis. This, in my mind, should be a perfect ACLU liberal case when the power of the government says, we are going to punish you for your inactivity. We're not punishing you because you're making guns. We're punishing you because you're not making guns. We're not punishing you because you bought this. We're punishing you because you didn't buy this. So is it fair for me to say this shouldn't just piss off conservatives, this should piss off liberals as well who are concerned about overreaching government?
You would think so. I think a lot of liberals are blinded by this is a good thing, therefore it doesn't matter how we do it. But it was very fascinating to watch how some of the editorial pages lined up and how some of the liberal legal profession, which is traditionally very liberal. Number one, the Washington Post, 2 days after we filed the suit, said this is a very serious constitutional issue and talked about the fact that the government had passed up more traditional constitutional ways to do this. Lawrence Tribe, people like that are saying, you know, this is a serious constitutional issue. So,
what about those people just say the federal law outweighs state law? It's just that simple. I've talked to lawyers who have said, listen, the federal government says this happens. They've got the power over the states. I mean, it's said as if it is just a blanket statement. You and your 19 colleagues around the country are just crazy.
But they're assuming that you're exercising an enumerated power. If you're exercising an enumerated power and you don't delegate any of it to the state, then the feds rule. And those of us in the conservative side of things have to deal with that issue in immigration, because interestingly enough, there is an enumerated power in immigration and naturalization. And we got to be consistent about that. But these guys are skipping the threshold issue. Is there an enumerated power that allows the government to reach out and force you to buy a product or service?
All right, let's go a different way. Because remember, Obama said this is not a tax. It's going to cost us a fortune, as it has in Massachusetts. This is not a tax. So what if I said it has nothing to do with the enumerated power? It has nothing to do with the Commerce Clause. Don't you seem to understand, Mr. Attorney General? The Congress has the power to tax. This is a tax. Therefore, stop this ridiculous lawsuit.
Well, great question, because Obama said in the election that it was not a tax. Said when he first proposed it, George Stephanopoulos, ABC, said, "Isn't this in fact a tax?" He said, "This is not a tax." And why that's turned out to be somewhat humorous is because when the federal government filed their motion to dismiss the Virginia case and our case, they essentially abandoned the Commerce Clause and said this is a tax. Here's why it's not a lawful tax. Once again, the federal government can impose a tax on a taxable transaction. If you're engaging in an economic transaction that they want to tax, they can impose a tax on it. Because of the 16th Amendment, they can tax your income and payroll. But they cannot tax you for sitting on your couch at home. That's what's called a head tax or a capitation tax. If you're not engaged in
A capitation tax?
Yeah.
That's what it's called, a capitation
per capita, a capitation
like
tax
that.
or a head tax. Article 1, Section 9 of the Constitution says any head tax, where they're saying we're imposing a tax on everybody in the United States just because you're alive, has to be apportioned.
In other words, the founders were worried about how the king raised money.
Exactly.
Which was the tax collector would knock on your door going, well, there's 5 of you here. You're going to pay us money because you happen to live in England and therefore you have it. So we wanted to make sure our tax system wasn't there, hey, I'm breathing, therefore I'm being taxed.
Well, it actually allows a capitation or head tax, but it has to be apportioned by the population of the state. And this is not, they're not saying, okay, Colorado has to pay a total amount because this is how many people they have. This is assessed because you didn't buy
So in
insurance.
other words, just like your interstate commerce argument, you're saying that because I don't do anything, I don't have insurance, you're going to tax me because I haven't purchased anything.
Because you haven't engaged in a
when
taxable
I buy this
transaction.
great fountain pen from coloradopen.com, when I do that, I might pay tax. I might not pay tax depending on the state, but I made a transaction. If I don't buy it, I still have to pay the tax on health care.
That's exactly right.
Talk to me about the other states. There are 19 of your colleagues that have joined you in this. I've heard numbers saying up to 38 states are doing something about this. What's the real number? Help me out.
It's a total of 21, really. There's 20 in this suit in the Northern District of Florida, and then Virginia has its own suit. Also, I think significantly, another plaintiff in our case is the National Federation of Independent Business, representing a couple 100,000 small businesses. Because
are they a plaintiff with you?
They're a plaintiff.
So in other words, we have 20 states that are plaintiffs and this small business group. Great organization, the NFIB.
That's exactly right, because as you know, there's penalties involved for small business that don't buy health insurance.
All right. Where do I keep hearing this number like there's 38 states doing something? Is that also the statutory changes that we're seeing in places like Missouri and other places?
I don't know where that 38 comes from.
Let's talk a little bit about my initiative, which with a little luck will be called Amendment 63. 63 would be a constitutional amendment for Colorado. It says that here in Colorado we have a right to health care choice, and we put it in our Bill of Rights. It also says that you can't be forced into a public or private health care plan. It also says you can't be told you can't pay cash if the doctor wants to take cash. Why is that important? Assuming you are successful, and you and the other 20 AGs are successful, what does that say about my initiative?
Let's first of all talk about what happens if we're not successful. Then the government, the federal government, asserts their supremacy. The courts have said this is within our enumerated powers. State of Colorado, you can't stop us from going out and touching each individual directly and getting this money. If we are successful, then Congress faces a choice of how do we get people to buy health insurance. And if they go to option B, which everybody thought they were going to go to at the first instance.
The Massachusetts option.
Right.
Basically.
Go to the states and say, if you want Medicaid money, you got to force your citizens to do it. If we have a constitutional provision that prohibits the state of Colorado from forcing their citizens to do it, that will effectively end that route